What would you do if you stepped outside on the coldest night in living memory and found 20 massive, bleeding wolves staring up at you from a ravine, alive but barely, their eyes holding something no animal's eyes should ever hold? Most people would go back inside. Most people would lock their doors, pull their blankets tighter, and tell themselves it was just the cold playing tricks on their minds. Elowyn Ravenwood went down into the dark. She didn't go down because she was brave. She went down because she couldn't stand the thought of something dying alone in the snow. And that single decision, made in about 3 seconds, with frost burning her lungs and zero visibility in front of her, changed everything about who she was, who she would become, and who had been waiting for her all along without either of them knowing it. Oh, this is her story, and I promise you, by the time we reach the end of it, you will never think about running away the same way again. The winter of February 2024 was not a normal winter. The Weather Service in Harlan County, West Virginia, described it afterward as a generational polar vortex collapse, the kind of cold that only visits a place once every few decades and leaves a mark on the people who survived it. Temperatures dropped to 38 degrees below zero. Mountain road operations had been suspended by the National Guard after nightfall. Emergency dispatch had issued a single, terrifying county-wide advisory that went out on every radio channel still working. If you are not already inside, we cannot reach you. Elowyn Ravenwood was already beyond reach. She had been beyond reach for 2 years. Well, she lived at the end of a 17-mile logging trail carved into the spine of Cold Ridge Mountain, a place that only existed on county maps because a timber company had needed to reach the trees once, a long time ago. The trail ended at Ravenwood Hollow, 12 acres of fenced land, 3 heated animal enclosures, a storage barn the size of a small house, a workshop, and a one-room cabin with a wood stove that Elowyn had learned to keep burning through the night like her life depended on it. Because sometimes, in February, it did. She was 23 years old. She had built Ravenwood Hollow with her own 2 hands after fleeing a life she never wanted to go back to. To the few residents of Millhaven, the nearest town was 11 miles down the mountain. She was simply the quiet young woman who preferred the company of injured foxes and orphaned deer to human conversation. She paid cash at the general store. She didn't wave at passing trucks. She didn't answer her door after dark. She asked no questions. She answered fewer. What no one in Millhaven knew, what almost no one in the world knew, was that Elowyn was not entirely human. She was an omega, a dormant, unshifted werewolf who had spent 2 years carefully, deliberately burying every trace of what she was. Her wolf had been silent so long that some nights she almost convinced herself it was gone entirely. Almost. She had escaped the Ashbourne Hollow Pack 26 months ago. Escaped is a gentle word for what she had actually done. She had faked her own death. She had waited for the autumn river flood, let the current take her coat and her scarf, and then she had run north through 3 counties in bare feet while the pack assumed the water had taken her. She had been 21 years old. She had been terrified every single step of the way, and she had not looked back once. The alpha of the Ashbourne Hollow Pack was named Xavian Coldridge. He was the reason she had run. He was the reason she had stayed hidden. He was the reason she had built her life on a mountain where no roads went, a life so quiet and so small that someone like him would never have any reason to come looking. She had almost started to believe she was safe. On the night of February 14th, at 11:52 in the evening, the floor of her cabin shook. It was not a sound. It was pressure. A deep, a physical vibration that moved through the floorboards and up through the soles of her boots like the earth itself had shifted. Elowyn was at her workbench, doing the only thing she ever did when the cold kept her awake. Sorting and resorting her medical supply cabinet, making sure everything was exactly where she would need it if one of her animals took a bad turn in the night. She went still. She listened. The storm outside was enormous. Wind like a sustained shout, ice raking the roof in waves, the kind of noise that swallowed smaller sounds whole. But she had heard something under all of it, or felt it. She put on her coat, her thermal layer, her boots, her gloves. She opened the cabin door. The cold hit her like a wall. Even through 4 layers, it stole the breath straight out of her lungs. She stood on the cabin porch and looked out into the white void of the blizzard, her headlamp cutting maybe 6 feet of visibility in front of her. Nothing. Just snow and dark and the groaning of pine trees bending under the weight of ice. Then she smelled it. Diesel fuel, burning metal, and underneath both of those, blood. She moved to the edge of the property and swept her lamp downward into the ravine below her tree line. The beam caught something 40 feet below. A glint. Then another. The dying pulse of emergency hazard lights, orange and weak, blinking through the snow like a signal no one was supposed to send. There was a truck in the ravine. An overturned armored transport vehicle, massive, black-plated, the kind of truck that did not belong on a logging road and definitely did not belong at the bottom of a ravine. And the insignia on the side panel was partially buried in snow, but she could make out 3 letters, V.P.S., Vantis Private Security, a contractor name she had heard before in a past life, associated with work that no one discussed in polite company. She stood at the edge of the ravine and stared at it for exactly 4 seconds. She could go back inside. She could lock her door and wait out the storm and call the county sheriff in the morning when the roads were passable, and let whoever handled this kind of thing handle it. Something inside her, not thought, not logic, something older and quieter and more insistent than either, said, "Go down." So she went down. She rigged the snowmobile winch to the strongest pine she could find at the ravine edge, loaded the sled with her emergency kit, and started the descent. Or the grade was nearly 40 degrees. The snow was waist-deep in places. 3 times the sled overturned, and she had to dig it out by hand while her fingers went from cold to numb to a burning she had learned not to panic about. The truck was worse up close. The cab had been sheared almost completely off on impact. The cargo section was reinforced. Military-grade steel, she realized, the kind that required dedicated cutting equipment to open. It had held, and inside it, in the cargo section, stacked in reinforced transport cages, bolted to the walls and floor, were the wolves. 20 of them. She stood in the ravine with the wind screaming around her, and her headlamp going over the cages one by one, and her brain tried to file this under wildlife trafficking, illegal transport, poaching operation. And it almost worked. Almost. Because the wolves were enormous, easily twice the size of any natural wolf she had ever treated, and the cages were built for something much stronger than any wolf she had ever seen. And around each massive neck, embedded in fur that was matted with blood, glowing a cold blue-white in the dark, were collars. Not GPS collars. Not tracking devices. Something else. Something with circuitry and silver plating and a smell she could not name, but that made the deepest buried part of her instinct snap awake with one single, silent alarm. She didn't stop to understand it. She couldn't afford to. Several of the wolves were barely breathing. The temperature in that ravine was dropping fast enough that she could feel the difference between when she had arrived and now, and she did not have long before the choice would be made for her, for she started moving. 7 hours. 7 hours of loading cage after cage onto the sled, winching them up the 40-degree grade one at a time, dragging them through waist-deep snow to the barn, transferring each wolf onto the heated floor before going back for the next. 7 hours of her body screaming at her to stop and her mind refusing to listen. She moved in silence. She didn't pray, and she didn't curse, and she didn't think about anything except the next cage, and the next wolf, and the next pull of the winch cable. By the time she dragged the last cage into the barn and slammed the great doors shut against the storm, she had been awake for 22 straight hours. Her vision swam at the edges. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely work the lock. She collapsed onto the concrete floor of the barn with 20 massive, barely alive predators arranged in their cages around her, the industrial heaters humming to life overhead, and she lay there for a long time just breathing. She had no idea what she had just carried into her home, but something deep inside her, something she had spent 2 years trying to silence, breathed a single, wordless sound into the cold air of that barn. It sounded, if she had been able to name it, like a rival. The barn heaters took 40 minutes to pull the temperature up to something bearable. Elowyn sat against the far wall with her knees drawn up, drinking coffee from a thermos that had gone cold, watching the steam rise off 20 enormous wet coats as the warmth reached them. She was watching for breathing. She was watching for movement. She was watching for any sign that the work she had just done had not been too late for any one of them. For a while, there was only the sound of the heaters and the storm outside, and the slow, labored breathing of 20 massive animals. Then the smell changed. It happened gradually, the way the room shifts when someone opens a window in summer. Not a single moment, but a tide coming in. The wet fur faded. What replaced it moved through the barn like something pouring in under the doors. Pine resin, dark amber, iron, ozone, and underneath all of those, something deeper and warmer and entirely impossible to name. Elowyn went perfectly still. That smell, that specific layering of scents. She had been raised in a pack. She had grown up learning the language of the nose before she learned to read. And she knew, even with her wolf buried so far down it was practically gone, she knew what that smell was. These were not wildlife. She pressed her back against the wall and breathed slowly, the way she had taught herself to think during a crisis. Not fast, not loud, not full of noise. Just one thing at a time. One clear thought, then the next. They were shifters. All of them. 20 massive shifters, locked in reinforced cages in her barn. She forced herself forward. She crouched in front of the nearest cage and made herself look, really look, at the collar around the wolf's neck. She had avoided examining them closely during the rescue. No time, no light, no margin. Now she looked at. It was not a restraint. It was a machine. Black metal, barely larger than a fist in cross-section, all fitted so precisely against the throat that it could not be pulled over the head. Circuitry etched into its surface in patterns she didn't recognize. The silver plating was unmistakable. Actual silver, not alloy. And where it rested against the skin, the fur beneath was matted and dark, the flesh raw in a way that went beyond pressure sores, a suppression collar. She had heard of them, stories, rumors, the kind of things that got whispered at the edge of pack gatherings and then never discussed directly. A device designed to flood the shifter's system with liquid silver through micro-needle delivery, paired with electrical pulses timed to override their natural healing cycle. It locked them in wolf form. It shut down their ability to shift. And over time, hours, not days, the silver toxicity built up in the blood until the heart stopped. She looked around the barn. 20 collars, 20 slowly dying shifters. She had to cut them, all 20. And cutting the collars meant releasing to the suppression, meant 20 traumatized, lethal, silver-poisoned shifters waking up in an enclosed space with her. She breathed in. She breathed out. She went and got the bolt cutters. She moved through the cages methodically, starting at the far left and working her way across. Each collar required both hands and all her weight on the cutters. Each time the metal cracked and fell away, she heard the sharp intake of breath as the wolf felt the suppression lift. A gasping, desperate sound like someone finally surfacing from underwater. Some stirred immediately. Some opened their eyes. Some just lay there shuddering as their bodies started the slow process of clearing silver from their blood. She talked to each one. She couldn't help it. She talked the way she talked to every injured animal that came through Ravenwood Hollow, quietly, steadily, not performing calm, but actually practicing it, because she had learned that animals felt the difference. I'm not going to hurt you. You're safe. Just breathe. Just breathe. Most of them stilled when she spoke. Most of them tracked her movement with eyes that were far too focused, far too aware for any animal she had ever worked with. She noticed this. She didn't let herself think too hard about it. She reached the last cage. She stopped. This cage was different, larger than the others, not by a few inches, but by a meaningful margin, as though it had been built to a separate specification. The bars were thicker, the walls were double-reinforced steel, and the interior showed evidence of a sustained, furious attempt to escape. The bars were bent inward, dented in patterns that suggested something had thrown its full weight against them, over and over, with a specific and deliberate violence. The wolf inside was the color of a starless sky. Every other wolf in the barn was massive. This one was something that made massive seem insufficient. Even lying collapsed on its side, it dominated the space in a way that went beyond size. A stillness to it, even in its injured state, that felt less like unconsciousness and more like controlled waiting. The shrapnel buried in its shoulder was jagged and deep, driven in by the impact of the crash. The collar around its neck had burned deeper here than anywhere else she had seen. The skin around the silver edges was grey, almost black, the kind of tissue damage that did not come back on its own. She needed to cut this collar. She needed to cut it right now, before the silver toxicity damage became irreversible. She took one step toward the cage. The smell hit her like a door swinging open onto something enormous. Cedar. Dark rain. Something ancient and warm and vast. Something that had no name in the vocabulary she used for the physical world. It came off this wolf in a wave, and it did not ask permission. It went straight past every wall she had built and hit the part of her she had been holding down for 2 years. The omega she had buried at the bottom of a river and walked away from. And it did not stir that part of her. It detonated it. She stumbled backward. Her hand went to her chest. Her heartbeat changed, literally changed rhythm, in the space of a single breath. A word rose from somewhere beneath conscious thought, vibrating in her sternum like a struck bell, too large for her body and too certain to be questioned. Mine. She pressed her back against the cage opposite and slid down it until she was sitting on the floor, staring at the wolf in cage 20, with her hands shaking and her eyes burning, and 2 years of carefully constructed silence falling apart around her like a wall in the rain. She didn't know who this wolf was. She didn't know what the bond meant for the invisible life she had stitched together, piece by piece on this mountain. Or she only knew, with the clarity of something that could not be argued with, that if she didn't cut that collar in the next few minutes, the creature her soul had just recognized across 2 years of silence would die on her barn floor. She grabbed the bolt cutters. She walked back to cage 20. She put her forehead against the cold bars and let herself shake for exactly 5 seconds. Then she cut the collar. The moment the collar broke, the barn changed. She felt it before she saw it. A shift in the air pressure, the same way a storm front arrives before the rain. Static electricity moved across her forearms. The temperature in the immediate vicinity of cage 20 seemed to drop by several degrees despite the heaters. The black wolf did not wake gradually. One moment, complete, absolute stillness. The next, silver eyes, are open and blazing, fixed with total precision on her face. Not scanning the room, not assessing his injuries, not registering the barn or the cages or the storm beyond the walls. He looked at her, and only her, and the intelligence behind that gaze was so unmistakably human that she felt the air leave her lungs all at once. He tried to rise. His body had other ideas. The shrapnel, the silver poisoning, the crash trauma. His body was fighting 3 different emergencies simultaneously, and even the strength she could feel radiating off him couldn't override all 3 at once. He made it halfway to standing before his legs gave out, and he hit the floor with a sound that shook the rafters and knocked ice from the barn roof in a cascade of frozen crystals. Elowyn didn't run. She grabbed her emergency medical kit and moved to the front of the cage, dragging it across the concrete floor, her hands working the latch before the rational part of her mind had quite finished processing what she was about to do. She was going to open the cage. She was going to go inside. She was going to try to help a wolf the size of a small vehicle that could probably bite through the bars she was unlatching. The wolf watched her the whole time. He didn't lunge. He didn't growl. He tracked her movements with those silver eyes and held absolutely still with a discipline that, she realized, was not passive. It was a choice. He was choosing not to move. He was choosing to let her close. She knelt beside him. The physical reality of his size only hit her fully once she was inside the cage. This close, that she could feel the heat coming off his body, the unnatural warmth that shifters ran even when they were injured, even when they were dying. She opened the kit. She looked at the shrapnel. "I have to take this out," she said. Her voice was steadier than she expected. "You're going to feel it. I need you to stay still." The silver eyes held hers. He lowered his great head slowly to his forepaws. He exhaled once, long and deliberate. She took that as consent. What followed was not clean. Removing shrapnel from a wound that deep was never clean. She had done it with deer and with foxes, and once, memorably, with a black bear that had been less cooperative than the animal currently allowing her hands into its injury. She gripped the forceps, found purchase on the jagged metal, and pulled. But the sound he made went through the walls of the barn, and probably through the walls of the mountain. It was not a yelp or a whine. It was the sound of something immense and powerful, refusing, on sheer will alone, to collapse under pain that would have dropped a lesser creature entirely. His body shook. His claws raked the concrete floor, leaving gouges she would find later and stare at for a long time. But he did not move toward her. Even in that moment, with agony tearing through his shoulder, his body's every instinct was protecting her from the fallout of it. The bleeding slowed. She packed the wound with everything she had, her hands moving with the automatic efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times in 100 different configurations. And then, impossibly gradually, the edges of the wound began to move together, or the shifter healing factor, fighting through the last of the silver toxicity, waking back up now that the collar was off. She sat back on her heels. She was covered in blood that was not hers. She was shaking from the base of her spine to the top of her skull. Behind her, the barn erupted. 19 wolves. Suppression lifted, senses returning, bodies waking back up to full awareness, caught the smell of blood and instinct took over. They threw themselves against the bars in a synchronized explosion of sound and force, the cages banging and scraping against the concrete floor, the noise filling the barn like a physical thing. Elowyn froze. She was in the open cage. She was between the injured wolf and the bars. She had nowhere to go. Kyle did not roar. He did not bark. He released something from the center of his chest that was not quite a sound and not quite a command. A frequency, low and bone deep, that lasted maybe 2 seconds and said nothing and everything simultaneously. Every wolf in the barn dropped, not slowly, not gradually. They dropped like strings being cut, 20 massive bodies sinking to the floor of their cages in unison, heads down, chins pressed to the concrete, eyes averted. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Elowyn had ever heard. She stayed very still, still kneeling on the floor of cage 20, and waited for her heartbeat to come back down from wherever it had gone. The black wolf turned his head toward her. Slowly, the silver eyes found her face again, and she saw something in them she hadn't seen before. Something that lived right at the edge of controlled. Something that looked, if she let herself name it, like relief. He leaned forward. He moved with deliberate slowness, his massive head crossing the space between them, and he pressed his nose against her cheek. Not a nudge. Not a sniff. A slow, intentional exhale against her skin, breathing her in, learning the specific signature of her, the way she had seen bonded shifters mark each other in the stories she had heard at pack fires a long time ago in another life. She felt it go through her like warm water through cold stone. She didn't know the full meaning of it yet, or she didn't know what that gesture told every shifter in the barn about who she was and what she meant and what had just happened between them without either of them choosing it. She only knew that the great dark wolf breathed her in and then exhaled, long and slow, and the tension went out of his body by degrees, and for the first time since she had found him, he looked like something that might actually survive the night. She reached out. She couldn't stop herself, and laid her hand gently against the side of his neck, above the raw skin where the collar had been. He closed his eyes. The storm pressed against the barn walls, and the heaters hummed, and the 19 wolves lay quiet on their barn floor, and Elowyn Ravenwood sat in the wreckage of everything she thought she knew about the shape of her life, or with the king's breathing evening out beneath her hand, and tried to understand what she had just stepped into the center of. She didn't succeed, but she didn't move her hand either. Dawn came slowly, the way it does after catastrophic nights. Not with color, but with a gradual grey lightening of the dark. The storm beginning to lose the worst of its voice, even while the cold held firm. Elowyn was still in the barn when it happened. She had fallen asleep against the wall at some point. Not a real sleep, just the kind of 20-minute unconsciousness that the body forces on you when you have given it no other choice. And she woke to the sound she had been half expecting and wholly dreading. The shift. It was not quiet. She had heard shifters in her pack transform before, long ago, and she had never grown entirely used to the sound of it, the way it moved through the room like a pressure change, the particular silence that preceded it, the sound of the world rearranging itself around a body, doing something a body should not be able to do. She kept her face to the wall until it was over. When she turned back, a man sat on a bale of hay across the barn from her. He was wrapped in the wool blanket she had thrown into the cage the night before, though it covered him only partially and seemed disinclined to cover more. He was built the way the mountains around her were built, not with the smooth, uniform architecture of deliberate effort, but with the layered, scarred density of something shaped by force over a very long time. Dark hair, pushed back from his face. Silver eyes, identical in color to the wolf's, which had not occurred to her as something that could carry over, but apparently did. Old scars mapped across the visible parts of his arms and chest with the specific randomness of a history that had not been kind. He looked at her the way the wolf had looked at her the night before. Directly. Completely. Like she was the only thing in the room that required his full attention, which, given that 17 other shifted wolves were currently watching both of them from their cages, was saying something. She became aware, quite suddenly, that she had blood on her face and hay in her hair, and had not slept in a meaningful way in over 30 hours. She did not move away. "You went into the ravine alone," he said. His voice was low and rough from disuse, the kind of voice that did not need to be loud to carry across a room. "In a polar vortex, or with a winch and a snowmobile." "Someone had to," she said. Something moved behind his eyes that was not quite a smile, and not one. Someone did. The mate bond hummed between them, warm and insistent, and entirely indifferent to her plans for her life. She could feel it now that the suppression collar was gone, and the distance between them had collapsed from 40 feet of barn to the span of one bale of hay. It was not the detonation from the night before, that raw, disorienting explosion of recognition. It had settled into something more like a current, steady and directional, pulling toward him the way a compass points north. She ignored it with the focused effort of someone ignoring a very large fire in a very small room. "You're a shifter," he said. Not a question. "Former," she said. "But there is no former." "There is, if you work at it long enough." She wrapped her hands around the cold thermos again, needing something to hold. "I'm a wildlife rehabilitator. You're leaving when the roads are passable." He looked at her for a long moment. The silver eyes did not waver. "My name is Kyle Ironheart," he said. "I am the Lycan King of the Eastern Territories." The thermos slipped in her hands. She caught it. The name registered in her memory like a struck match. She had heard it before, in the pack, spoken in lowered voices, referenced the way people referenced storms that hadn't arrived yet. The Iron King, the Cold Throne, the Eastern Line. Names for the same unmovable fact. The most powerful alpha in 400 miles, a man whom other alphas did not challenge, and survived. In her barn, in her blanket, 3 feet away. No, she said nothing for a moment. Then, "The ambush. Not random," he said. "Vantis Private Security doesn't find a royal convoy without inside knowledge and silver-grade weaponry. Before the crash, I heard the mercenaries' radio. They were taking us to a private site, an elimination site." He paused. "The alpha who contracted the hit. They used his name on the radio. Xavier Coldridge." The thermos hit the floor. She didn't notice. She was somewhere else entirely. Somewhere cold and small and very far back, at the edge of the Millhaven River, in the middle of an autumn flood, with her coat in the water, and her lungs screaming, and her legs carrying her north, through 3 counties, while behind her, the pack believed the current had taken her. Kyle watched her face and said nothing. He simply waited. "He thinks I'm dead," she said. Her voice had gone quiet and flat, in a way she recognized as the voice she used when she was keeping very still inside. "I faked my death to escape him. 2 years ago. He thinks I drowned in the river." Kyle's eyes darkened, not with anger, with something colder and more deliberate than anger, the calculation of a man assessing a threat. Xavier's territory borders Cold Ridge Mountain. She looked up. The truck was moving through his territory, Kyle said, quietly. He wasn't only trying to eliminate my guard. He was routing through this mountain on the way to his own execution site, 3 miles east of this property. He held her gaze. "You are on Cold Ridge. You are alive. And Xavier Coldridge leaves no loose threads." The silence stretched between them, and in it she understood everything he was not saying. She had spent 2 years becoming invisible on the one mountain that sat at the intersection of Xavier's ambitions and the Lycan King's travel route. She had not been safe. She had been sitting in the middle of something she didn't know was moving, waiting for the 2 ends of it to close around her. Kyle stood. He was tall. She had registered this in the abstract, in the barn, watching him from across the room. But standing, close, he redefined the concept in a way that required a moment to adjust to. He crossed the space between them, and she did not back up, and he stopped close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cold barn air. He reached out and pushed a strand of hair back from her face. Carefully, the way you handle something you have only just begun to understand the value of. She did not pull away. "For when the storm clears," he began. The mechanical groan reached them both at the same moment. Low, heavy, the unmistakable sound of large vehicles laboring through deep snow on a road that was barely a road. Coming from the north. Coming from the direction of the logging trail. Elowen moved to the barn's frost-covered window in 3 steps and pressed her face close to the glass, her breath fogging the view. Through the tree line, 3 pairs of headlights, close together, moving with purpose. They were not lost travelers. They were not rescue services. They were moving too fast and too straight for the conditions, the way a convoy moves when it knows exactly where it's going. She stepped back from the window. "They're already here," she said. The barn reorganized itself in under a minute. Kale spoke 1 word, and the Iron Fang Legion moved with the automatic, wordless coordination of soldiers who had drilled for this in every terrain imaginable, inside a barn with limited space and limited weaponry, and bodies still clearing silver from their blood, but drilling nonetheless. 19 wolves shifted back to human form in a cascade of pressure and sound and motion. They were all large men, every one of them, built for the thing they were, moving with the focused economy of people for whom combat was not a last resort, but a practiced skill. Elowen went to the basement. She came back with the rifle, the shotgun, 2 sidearms, and every round of ammunition she kept stored for the predator situations she had promised herself she would never need it for. Kyle took the rifle without ceremony and did not ask her if she knew how to use the rest of it. He simply looked at her and said, "Basement, safe room, reinforced steel. Do not come out until I come for you. And if you don't come for me?" A pause. The silver eyes held hers for 1 second longer than strictly necessary. "I'll come for you," he said. And then he pushed the barn door open. Xavier Coldridge stepped out of the lead vehicle, like a man arriving at a social engagement, unhurried, immaculate, his tailored coat somehow untouched by the conditions his vehicle had just driven through. His hair was ash blonde, his eyes a pale gold that caught the winter light with the specific warmth of something that was not actually warm at all. He was not a large man, not by shifter standards. But he had the kind of authority that did not require size, the absolute, unstudied confidence of someone who had never genuinely believed that a situation could turn against him. He stepped into the snow of Elowin's yard, and he inhaled. She watched from the basement window, the one small ground-level rectangle she had refused to give up, the one she kept clear of frost for exactly this kind of reason, the one she pressed her face to, now because she could not make herself not look. She saw the moment Xavier caught her scent on the air. She saw the moment 2 years of believing she was dead collapsed in his expression, replaced by something that was euphoric and ugly in equal measure. His head turned toward the barn. His lips curved into something she had spent 2 years trying to forget the exact shape of. Kyrox and Theron moved to the east. Riker held the center line, a sidearm in each hand. Daxton and Lycan took the vehicles. Kyle stood in front of the barn doors with the rifle held with a quiet competence that suggested he was entirely comfortable using it. And he looked at the man across the yard with the expression of a king acknowledging a problem that was about to be resolved. Xavier spread his hands, a gesture of expansiveness, of ease. "Your Majesty," he said. His voice carried the Pack Alpha command even in casual register, a resonance built to press down on Omega instincts from across a field. "I have to say, you're looking surprisingly functional for someone who was supposed to be in pieces by now. Vantis charges a great deal for their failures." "They'll have an opportunity to discuss that," Kyle said. "Briefly." "I imagine." Xavier glanced at the barn, at the windows, at the property layout with the assessing sweep of someone cataloguing exits. "I find myself more interested in your accommodations. Someone was very helpful in the middle of the night, very compassionate." The pale gold eyes settled somewhere behind Kyle. "It's a very particular kind of compassion, isn't it? The kind that walks into a ravine alone in a polar vortex." He paused. She always did have more of it than was useful. The firefight erupted without ceremony. Kyrox went left in a blur of motion, taking 2 of Xavier's enforcers before they had processed that he was moving. Theron hit the right flank. Riker walked forward through the center, as both sidearms firing with the mechanical precision of someone who had done exactly this before and intended to do it several more times. Daxton reached the first vehicle, and Lycan reached the second, and for approximately 90 seconds, the yard in front of Ravenwood Hollow became something Elowin watched from the basement window, with her hands pressed flat against the glass, and her breath coming in short, silent bursts. Then the canisters came out. Xavier's lieutenant, tall, methodical, entirely unbothered by the firefight, unlocked a case from the third vehicle and withdrew a broad-barrel launcher. The canisters it fired were silver, not silver-colored, not silver-plated, actual silver nitrate, aerosolized, laced with wolfsbane, concentrate at a ratio Elowin recognized from stories as weapons grade rather than deterrent grade. Thus they arced across the yard in a high, slow trajectory and landed at 3 points: the barn entrance, the left flank position, the center. They burst in clouds of white chemical haze. She watched Kyrox go down first, mid-stride, his legs simply stopping beneath him. Theron dropped to one knee, then both. Riker pressed his hand to the wall of the barn and slid down it slowly, fighting every inch, losing. The chemical compound found the residual silver in their systems from the suppression collars and amplified it, the two working together in the blood like a conversation that ended one way, one by one, everyone. Kyle fought the longest. She had not understood, watching him in the barn, watching him in the quiet of the pre-dawn, exactly how much of what he was. He was holding back. She understood now. He moved through the white haze like something that had learned long ago not to need clean air to function, throwing Xavier's enforcers aside with the flat efficiency of a man removing obstacles rather than engaging in combat. But the aerosolized silver was not something that could be fought through indefinitely, and the wound in his shoulder, the one she had stitched closed with her own hands 5 hours ago, was open again. She could see the dark spread of it through his shirt. He dropped to one knee in the snow. Just one. Just barely. His head was still up. His eyes were still forward. His body was still fighting the simple physics of collapse with everything he had left. But one knee in the snow was the image she was going to carry for the rest of her life. The Lycan King, or the man who had silenced 19 traumatized shifters with a single breath, brought to one knee in the yard of a wildlife sanctuary by a man who had spent 2 years making her believe she was worth nothing. Xavier walked toward him slowly. He was not in a hurry. He had all the time he believed the world owed him, which was all of it. He stopped in front of Coil and crouched, bringing himself eye level with the kneeling king, and he tilted his head with the curiosity of someone examining something that had surprised them by surviving as long as it did. Then he didn't look at Kyle anymore. He looked at the barn. He looked at the basement window. He found, somehow, exactly where she was, and his pale gold eyes settled on hers through the glass with the certainty of a man who has never had to search for something he considered his. He smiled. "Come out, little Omega," he said softly, and his voice carried through the glass and through the walls, and through 2 years of silence, straight into the center of her chest. "I always knew the river didn't take you." She stayed at the window for exactly 10 seconds after Xavier spoke. 10 seconds, while the white chemical haze drifted through the yard, and the Iron Fang Legion lay collapsed in the snow, and Kyle knelt with one hand pressed to the ground, keeping himself upright through sheer refusal to stop. 10 seconds in which every survival instinct she had built over 2 years told her the same thing it had told her at the river. Run, hide, disappear, become small enough that he loses interest. And then something older than survival answered. She was not at the river anymore. She was not 21 years old, and running barefoot through 3 counties with nothing but fear to fuel her. She was 23, and she had built every wall of this place with her own hands, and she had gone down into the dark of a ravine in a polar vortex alone because she could not stand something dying without trying, and she had reached into the wound of a dying king and pulled the metal out with her bare hands, and she had not flinched. She was not the person Xavier had told her she was. She had never been that person. He had just convinced her, for long enough, that she was. She went up the basement stairs. She went through the cabin. She pushed the cabin door open and walked out into the cold. The yard registered her in waves. First Xavier, his smile going briefly, then beautifully uncertain for the first and only time she had ever seen it happen. Then his lieutenant, hand tightening on the launcher. Then 2 of his enforcers, stepping sideways to flank. And then Cale, on one knee in the snow, raising his head with the last functional measure of what he had left, and his silver eyes found her face and went wide with something she hadn't seen in them before. Fear. Not for himself. For her. "Run," he said. The word came out hoarse and quiet, stripped of the authority his voice usually carried, reduced to the plain fact of what he meant. "Elowin. Run." She looked at him for a moment, long enough to let him see that she had heard him, long enough to let him see that she had made a different choice. Then she looked at Xavier. She walked across the snow in bare feet, for she felt the cold of it as a sensation without urgency. the way you notice weather when you are already focused on something larger. She stopped 10 feet from Xavier, and she looked at the man who had spent 2 years living in her nightmares, and she felt nothing like what she expected. Not terror, not the specific kind of small, shrinking cold that his voice had always produced in her before. Something cleaner than that. Something that had been there a long time, waiting for the right conditions to surface. She looked at him the way you look at something you have finally correctly identified. "I spent 2 years believing the things you told me," she said. Her voice was steady. Not performed steadiness, actual steadiness, the kind that comes from being so certain of what you are saying that the words don't require effort. About what omegas are worth, about what I was worth, about the fact that the only reason I was safe was because you allowed it. She paused. "I want you to know that I know now that every single word of that was a lie, and I want you to know that I'm not afraid of you." Xavier's smile thinned. "You should be." "I know," she said. "That's the part that surprises me too." She stopped trying to hold it down. Whatever she had been keeping sealed for 2 years, whatever the bond, the collars, the suppression, the running and the grief had been pressing back into the deepest available corner of her chest. She stopped holding it down, and it rose. It did not come as anger. It did not come as grief. It came as something older than both of those, a sound that was not a scream and not a howl, not a human voice and not an animal one, but something that lived in the space between them and had been there since before either language existed. A resonance. It moved from the center of her chest outward, and it moved not through the air, but through the earth, through the bones of the mountain, through the matter of everything standing on that mountain at that moment. It went through the chemical haze like the haze was not there. The white cloud dissolved. Not drifted, not dispersed, dissolved, burned away in a clean circular wave that moved out from where she stood with the unhurried completeness of a tide going out. The silver nitrate and the wolfsbane vanished from the air as if they had never been there. In the collapsed bodies of the Iron Fang Legion, something changed. Kyrox lifted his head, then Theron, then Riker straightened from the wall. One by one, for the Iron Fang Legion rose, not slowly, not with the careful effort of damaged bodies recovering, but with the immediate, complete restoration of people who have been handed back something that was taken from them. The silver toxicity that had been building in their blood for 12 hours cleared. Their healing factors woke fully. They stood, and they stood completely. Kyle rose last. She felt it through the bond before she saw it, a surge of something vast and old that moved through the connection between them like a current reversing its direction. He rose from his knee, and he kept rising, and as he rose, the shift took him, and it was not the same shift she had heard in the barn at dawn. This was something older and larger. His full Lycan form, the form that lived between wolf and human in the way that only Lycan Kings could hold, to standing nearly 8 feet in the snow, with dark fur and silver eyes, blazing like stars seen from the bottom of the ocean. He looked at her once. Across the yard, through the cleared air, the bond singing between them like a wire pulled taut between 2 points that had always been meant to connect. She looked back at him. She gave him the smallest nod. He turned. Xavier ran. He made it 4 steps before the ground shook. The silence that followed was the loudest thing the Cold Ridge Mountains had ever held. Elowyn stood in her bare feet in the snow of her own yard and breathed, and around her the Iron Fang Legion stood quiet, and the storm finally began to still. Justice, when it came, was not loud. There was no speech. There was no negotiation and no extended confrontation. Ezavian Coldridge, the man who had built a life on the certainty that the world would always rearrange itself for him, faced the Lycan King in his full form and found that there was exactly one outcome available to him. And then that outcome arrived. Kyle shifted back to human form and stood in the snow of Elowin's yard, while his second, Gideon Northvale, a quiet, efficient man who had appeared from the tree line with the same unannounced competence that defined everything the Ironfang Legion did, began the process of dealing with what remained. The Vantis mercenaries were restrained with a speed that suggested the Ironfang had done this before, in worse conditions with less recovery time. They were chemically relieved of their short-term memory of the encounter, a procedure Elowin watched with more calm than she expected to feel. It was standing in her yard in bare feet, while men with specialized equipment made targeted adjustments to other men who had chosen their profession, knowing its risks. Gideon catalogued the silver-grade weapons, the chemical canisters, the launcher, the communications equipment. All of it was photographed, documented, and arranged with the care of someone who understood that evidence is only useful when it is preserved correctly. Before nightfall, the county sheriff would find 5 restrained men with illegal weapons and a vehicle bearing the Vantis insignia. Vantis would disavow them before the report was filed. No federal trails, no supernatural exposure, just the clean, unglamorous resolution of a problem by people who had been resolving problems of this kind for a very long time. The barn was salvageable. The yard would take some work. The logging road was going to need attention before any of the vehicles could use it properly. None of that was what occupied Elowin's mind. She stood at the edge of her property and looked at what she had built. The fenced enclosures where the fox with the mended leg was probably watching all of this with the unbothered curiosity of a creature that had stopped expecting the world to make sense. The workshop where she had made her own tools because she couldn't always afford to buy them. The barn with its industrial heaters and its concrete floor where 20 shifters had spent a night healing because she had gone down into a ravine alone, and decided, without quite thinking about it, that dying was not an acceptable outcome for something that was still trying to live. 2 years of her life, or 2 years of building something small enough to be invisible, quiet enough to go unnoticed, careful enough that the wrong people would never have a reason to come looking. She had been wrong about the invisible part, but she had built it anyway, and it had turned out to be exactly what was needed. Kyle came to her. She heard him before she saw him, the particular sound of him moving through the snow, unhurried, the same quality of presence he had carried even when he was in wolf form and bleeding on her floor. He stopped beside her and looked at what she was looking at, and for a moment they stood in silence together, and she found that silence with him felt different from the silence she had made a practice of for 2 years. Not empty. Not a wall. Something that could hold things. He turned to face her. She turned to face him, brought in the full light of a winter afternoon, after the storm had finally broken and the sky had gone to that particular sharp blue that only happens when the cold eases after something extreme. He looked like what he was. Scarred and powerful and tired in a way that went deeper than one bad night, with silver eyes that had been doing the work of carrying the weight of the Eastern Territories for long enough that the weight had left its mark. He had gone down into that ravine and not come back out the same person. So had she. They were even. "You called," he said. His voice was quiet, the rough edge of it softened by something she didn't have a word for yet. From inside a locked basement, with nothing. "I had something," she said. What? She looked at him. You were on one knee. But I wasn't going to leave you on one knee. The unsmile moved across his face, the one she had first seen at dawn, over a cold thermos in a blood-stained barn. And then it changed, became something fuller, something that reached his eyes for the first time, and the effect of it was significant enough that she had to remind herself to breathe. He cupped her face in both hands. She felt the warmth of him, the specific temperature of a shifter's skin, the calluses on his palms from a life that had not been gentle. She did not step back. She did not look away. The bond between them settled, not the explosive, world-altering detonation from the barn, but something that had found its level, something that had the weight and permanence of a foundation being laid beneath a structure that both of them, she suspected, were going to spend a long time building. When he kissed her, she understood something she had been turning over since the barn. It was not a beginning. It was not even a middle. It was a recognition, the specific moment when two separate things that have been circling each other for as long as either of them has existed finally acknowledge the gravitational pull between them and stop pretending it isn't there. She had been running toward this. He had been moving toward this, from different directions, by different roads, through different losses, but the direction had always been the same. Late afternoon, the Iron Fang Legion organized the convoy on the logging road with the quiet efficiency of 19 men who had been doing this their entire lives and had no feelings about a few hours of logistics. Or the cleared snow of Elowin's yard was already turning to ice again in the dropping temperature. She stood in the doorway of the sanctuary she had built from nothing. Every timber, every fence post, every heated enclosure earned by 2 years of solitude and work and stubborn refusal to be found. And she looked at it for a long time. She was not leaving because she was driven out. She hadn't been driven out. She had walked out of this barn into her own yard in bare feet, and she had done something that the woman who had run across 3 counties in the dark 2 years ago could not have done. And that woman was still inside her, but she was not alone in there anymore. She was leaving because she was done being invisible, because the person she had become on this mountain was bigger than the mountain could hold, because somewhere in the Eastern Territories there was a throne that the Lycan world was going to need to understand had a Luna, and that Luna had been a wildlife rehabilitator on Cold Ridge Mountain, and she was bringing that with her. She picked up the bag she had packed while Gideon coordinated the vehicles. She walked across the yard. She climbed into the passenger seat beside Cale. Her hand found his on the console between them. His fingers closed around hers with the matter-of-fact certainty of someone who had decided, and was not in the habit of undeciding. The convoy moved north. Elowin Ravenwood went down into the ravine to save 20 wolves from freezing. She didn't know she was also pulling herself out of the cold, and she didn't know that the most dangerous thing she had ever done, choosing compassion over self-preservation on the worst night in living memory, was the first step in becoming the woman the Lycan world would one day speak of in the way they had once spoken of Cale Ironheart, in lowered voices, with something that landed between respect and awe. She only knew the wolves needed her. It turned out she needed them too. And sometimes, not often but sometimes, the things we do for others and the things we do for ourselves are the exact same thing, dressed in different reasons, arriving at the same door. Cold Ridge Mountain disappeared behind the tree line. Elowin did not look back.